Good afternoon and welcome to another installment of the National Security Space Budget Series brought to you by the National Security Space Association's Mormon Center for Space Studies. You may notice that I'm not our usual moderator, Chris Williams, Mormon Center Chair. My name is Matt McNitt. I'm the Director of Operations for the National Security Space Association, and I'm well aware of the hole I'm attempting to fill in Chris's absence and request your patience in my attempt. Today, we're pleased to provide you with highlights of the President's budget request for fiscal year 24, along with congressional perspectives on the FY24 budget in this year's defense appropriations and authorization bills as we enter into conference period. To help us understand these issues, we are delighted to have with us today two very talented national security space budget analysts, NSSA's own Mr. Mike Tierney and Mr. Todd Harrison. Thanks for your time today, gentlemen. Mike Tierney is a consultant at Velos LLC and Chief of Legislative Affairs at NSSA, where he leads our congressional education outreach activities. Mike is well known for his timely and objective analysis of U.S. investments in national security space capabilities. He performs detailed analysis on legislative, regulatory, budget, and acquisition policies affecting the federal market. Many of our friends on Capitol Hill rely on Mike's thoughtful analysis to help guide their understanding of the intricacies of the military space budget. Also joining us is Matreya's Todd Harrison. Todd is Managing Director of Matreya Strategic Insights, where he leads the company's efforts to conduct innovative, insightful, and pathfinding research. Prior to joining Matreya in May of 2022, Mr. Harrison was a senior fellow and Director of Defense Budget Analysis at the Aerospace Security Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. At CSIS, he led the center's efforts in providing in-depth, nonpartisan research and analysis of defense funding, space security, and air power issues. Todd is also a highly valued member of NSSA's Board of Advisors. A quick word about our format before we get started. Todd will start us off with some highlights of the overarching DoD budget request. Then Mike will brief us on the FY24 budget request for national security space systems and programs. As with all space-time interviews, we strongly encourage audience participation. If you have a question for Todd or Mike, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I'll do my best to get through as many audience questions as possible. Without further ado, I'm pleased to turn the mic over to Todd Harrison, who will be followed by Mike Tierney. Todd, the floor is yours.
All right. Thanks, Matt. Good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be back here. Mike and I doing the tag team again, looking at budget issues. I guess, where we are right now in the process is what's on everyone's mind, at least in DC and in the military. All indications are we are barreling down the road towards a government shutdown come October 1st. I wanted to just, I'm going to throw up a chart here for a second and just, share kind of how I'm looking at this from a historical perspective. The purple bars you see here, those are delays in the budget submission each year. The green is delays in the enactment of the NDAA, that's the authorization bill. The blue are the delays in enactment of defense appropriations. So at the end of the day, to get a budget, you need appropriations. We have a hard deadline for that. It is the start of the fiscal year. The NDAA is more of a soft deadline. You'd like to have it enacted by the first of the fiscal year. More often than not, if you look down historically, the NDAA is typically enacted about 90 days or so after the start of the fiscal year, at least in recent years. So that puts it in late December. So, typically Congress is trying to finish up the NDAA before it leaves for the winter holidays. Appropriations, though, can often take a lot longer. And usually what's holding up appropriations, at least in the past, 10, 15 years, is getting to an agreement on the overall framework for the budget for that year, particularly the top line for defense and non-defense in the discretionary budget. Well, this year we had an early standoff over the debt ceiling. And I think when we did this back in the spring after the budget request came out, that's all our attention was focused on, okay, how are we going to get past this debt ceiling deadline? Well, Congress did it. They pulled the rabbit out of the hat and came up with a 2-year budget deal. And that budget deal actually resurrected the budget caps from the whole sequestration period. It set caps on defense and non-defense for FY24 and FY25. Now, on the surface, you would look at that and say, aha, we've gotten past the biggest hurdle. We've got agreement on the top line for defense for the next 2 years. They ought to be able to proceed ahead and get bills enacted into law without that obstacle in the way. Well, it turns out, while we had a deal on paper, not everyone in the House was happy with that deal. And so now we see more and more pressure from the Freedom Caucus, the wing of the Republican Party in the House, to enact appropriations that are well below those budget caps. Really, they're focused primarily on the non-defense side of the budget. Some of them are also calling into question the defense side of the budget as well. So while we had a deal, and that did get us past the debt ceiling, issue for a while, it looks like we don't really have a deal. And so all bets are off, and it's looking more and more like Speaker McCarthy will not be able to get the votes to pass appropriations through the House, or even a CR, even getting a CR passed through the House in order to continue the basic functions of government past October 1st. I say we are barreling down this road right now. I am not seeing any viable off-ramps at this point. Now, that doesn't mean a government shutdown is a certain by any means, but it is looking more and more likely every day that goes by that we're not going to get to a CR by October 1st. And even if we get to a CR, and that could happen, that there's a breakthrough at the last minute, they manage to get a CR enacted, or we have a government shutdown. And then to end that shutdown after however many days, weeks, or months, they end up passing a CR. Even after we eventually get to a CR, we still don't have clarity on how we're going to get to full year appropriations. So a lot is on the table here. A lot's at risk. I would point out the last time that we had a government shutdown that affected defense and wasn't just like a technical shutdown over a weekend or something was back at the beginning of FY14. And so that's when the budget caps had gone into effect already. Sequestration had hit in FY13. And then we started the fiscal year 14 on a government shutdown. If I recall, I think it was about 18 days. Maybe it was 16 days. I'm getting old now. Can't remember that far back. Shutdown affected DoD. Of course, you go through the process, and DoD is already going through that process now, putting out guidance on how to implement a government shutdown, what activities are accepted from the shutdown, what are not. It's become pretty standard operating procedure now for DoD. But it will be incredibly disruptive, not just for the department, not just for national security, but for our industrial base as well. And so, we are headed towards that uncertain future now. Not sure how we're going to get out of it, but we ought to start thinking about what is the end game. The other thing I will point out, looking at this, historical chart here, I'm going to scroll down. I've got the data on when defense appropriations were enacted all the way back to fiscal year 68. And recall that prior to FY76, the start of the fiscal year was 76 and earlier. The start of the fiscal year was actually earlier. It was July 1st. Looking back at this history, and I've actually don't have the data shown here, but I've gone back all the way to the beginning of the annual federal budget process, which I think was 1922. We have never had a full year continuing resolution for defense. So about this time of year, you do start to hear people worry about that, not just the risk of a shutdown or the risk of a CR that might last a long time into the fiscal year. You hear people worrying about the risk of a full year CR. Well, I'm not saying it couldn't happen, but I'm saying it has never happened. So it would be completely unprecedented. Most likely what we're going to see is, even if there's a shutdown, we'll eventually get to a CR, and that CR will eventually get us to full year defense appropriations. The record to beat right now on the longest delay in getting to full year defense appropriations is May 5th. That happened back in 2017. So you're talking 7 months into the fiscal year at that point. That is the record that we hopefully will not beat, but that's the longest that we've ever gone on a CR in a fiscal year for defense. Other parts of government, different story. So, that's kind of the state of the landscape, where we're, where things are potentially headed. Let me pull up another chart here. Can you guys see this? This chart basically just shows the marks from coming out of each of the committees. And of course, keep in mind that the SAC,
on the old slide.
Oh, it's still on the old slide. All right, here, hold on. I might have to stop and reshare to get this up there. All right. There. Can you guys see the chart now? All right. Keep in mind that the SAC-D bill has come out of committee, but it has not passed the full chamber yet. And all of these bills, once they go into conference and we get the final bill out of them, it's going to be something different than you see here. But this at least lets you see where the 4 defense committees have marked their bills so far. And you see here a lot of difference. And I'm just showing the differences here in the overall DoD budget by title to highlight, where the committees are and, in different places. The one that's kind of the most outlier, the most extreme here is the House Appropriations bill. And looking, where the HAC-D came out at, they added a lot of money to O&M. They cut a lot of money out of procurement. This is all relative to the president's budget request. And they added the most money, almost $2 billion into RDT&E. And particularly if you compare the HAC bill in blue to the Senate appropriations bill in green, there are many areas where they are going in opposite directions of one another or to very different extremes. So there's still a lot to be worked out in terms of the details. But, if you were to step back and just look at the bills that have come out of the committees, you would say, hey, there's a lot of bipartisan agreement here. There's always going to be differences between appropriators and authorizers. There's always going to be differences between the House and the Senate. That's the kind of political friction that the framers absolutely intended to have in our system, but they can work that out. They can work through those disagreements. These were bipartisan bills, at least so far. And so, that's kind of the framework for where we are. And this would look like a relatively normal bill season, a normal budget season. But, if it weren't for the political disagreements beyond defense that are really shaping up in the House and within the Republican caucus in the House, to a lesser extent, it's worth noting the hold on all military nominations getting through the Senate by Senator Tuberville. That kind of is the exception right now, though, in the Senate in terms of the hyper political atmosphere. Otherwise, in the Senate, they seem to be functioning largely under regular order. It's pretty amazing that the Senate Appropriations Committee has passed all 12 appropriations bills, at least out of committee. At this point in the cycle, that's record speed for the Senate. They don't normally move that fast on all of their bills, but yet they have. But everything is grinding to a halt right now until we figure out a way to get just to a CR to keep the government open past October 1st. So while I stop there, I'll hand it over to Mike, and he'll take you through more of the details when it comes to the space part of the budget.
Thank you, Todd. Wonderful as always. Let me see if I can get the right screen up here. Can you guys see my screen now? Take that as a yes. Matt, can you see that one? Whoops, how about right here?
Perfect.
Wonderful. Sorry about that. Todd, again, just want to, at the outset say thank you again. This is, for those that don't know, this is probably the 7th year maybe that Todd and I have been doing this together. We've been kind of doing this song and dance of DoD then space since fiscal year 17. And we've seen a lot, through that. I always enjoy kind of the way that you present it. The fact that you go back to fiscal year 1922 to do due diligence, you're obviously cut from the same cloth in many regards. So thank you to you for always supporting this event. I'm here with my kind of NSSA hat on, but also with my VLOS hat on. I get to be in front of the camera here today to present this material, but there's a large team, a very qualified team that put this together. Folks like Hillary, Lior, Will in particular on the VLOS team that are really, the data analyst experts that put the data engine behind this. So with that kind of intro and thanks, this is not the rosiest version of this that Todd and I will have given in our 7 years, both on his sense where we are in the macro political climate in terms of the appropriation cycle and a potential shutdown. But to provide a little context, we've been doing this for a long time, and back in fiscal year 20, the Space Force budget was appropriated by Congress and was $14.5 billion. That's just the Space Force portion. In 21, it grew kind of in total, including DoD and Space Force, to $17 billion, from 22 up to 21 billion. And we saw this kind of significant year-over-year growth. And that was fueled by a perfect storm of the threat environment, technological innovation on the commercial side, just the natural existing recapitalization needed of architectures inside of the Space Force. There's a natural cyclical nature of the satellite development process that was kind of coinciding, but really the universal political support kind of provided the fuel for this this year-over-year growth. However, we're starting to see, maybe that is starting to come to an end. I blocked out the right side of this chart just because I don't want you to get too alarmed or distracted, and just to provide a little bit of a landscape here at first to our methodology. The Space Force line, the Space Force budget now is very clearly presented inside of the DoD, overall budget. The Space Force, has its own many colors of money, and the Space Force line is an aggregate that tracks very much one-to-one with what the Department, Air Force, and Space Force present themselves in terms of their budget. The remainder of these lines, Air Force, Army, Navy, OSD, that we aggregate into this DoD space total budget, there is no direct alignment. This is kind of our best effort, but it includes things like inside of OSD, like DARPA space programs and technology, pretty obvious, some Navy, SATCOM lines, same with Army, Air Force support to US Space Command. So we kind of aggregate all of those, but again, officially Space Force kind of tracks, the others are our best effort to kind of get to a raw number. So you can see, again, I was giving you the indication it was 14, 17, 21, 24. Congress last year over the request gave $2.5 billion to the portfolio I'm about to show you, over the request of $24 billion, which again was year over year, a substantial increase in the request. This year comes around, another year over year substantial request increase over enacted up to $30 billion. In this honeymoon period that the Space Force and the space budget has had with the Hills, appears to be somewhat over. Rather than substantial year-over-year increases, we're seeing actually, reductions by the appropriators across, both House and Senate appropriators to this portfolio. Not a huge reduction, as you can see from the numbers, and we'll get into, what makes up the component reductions. But just from a trajectory, from a theme standpoint, from where we've been to where we are now, we're in a much different landscape. If, I was to brief this exact chart last year, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lot more green. So maybe this is just the numbers working out, right? Some natural program reductions, things come to a natural conclusion and the budget just naturally declines. So I don't want you to take my word for it that the situation's a little bit more significant than that. The reductions are being motivated by some substantial concerns being articulated by the appropriators, not just this year, but over prior fiscal years, over the overall portfolio management. So this is hack report language. This is the Appropriations Committee on the House side. This is on overall Space Force acquisition. They point out these year-over-year increases of 15% from request to enacted. They also point out that the FYDP that has been provided, the Future Years Defense Program, the 5-year outlook for all these programs also increased $16 billion over what was provided to the Hill last year. So they're seeing and noting substantial increases. But this is really kind of indicting language, and it's kind of consistent on a year-to-year basis from the Appropriations Committee, and should, be a clear message to, the Space Force management. Despite these significant increases, budget continues to include serious shortfalls, disconnects, does not fully fund several core programs. None of these programs are new. All of the things they must have. They should not count on double-digit top-line increases to address future funding shortfalls and reduce acquisition risk. Pretty clear, pretty concerning. I've got a list, and they list specific programs by name that are missing their FYDP, specific programs by name that have poor performance, and we'll get into those as we go on. Maybe it's not just hack, right? Maybe it's just hack. Maybe it's just the House appropriators that feel this way. But the Senate appropriators provided almost a very similar rationale, establishing the year-over-year substantial increases, a 15% increase, and a clear statement that that is no longer happening. Despite that, we're providing a reduction of $350 million, and then a rationale for why. Hey, we continue to support the Space Force. We've supported the Chief of Space Operations training initiatives. They provided assistance in classified areas, but really all the recommended program adjustments are based purely on the cost schedule and performance of the programs that therein lie. They're not prejudicial. It's just you're doing a terrible job managing your programs, and where we saw that, we cut them, is the candid way of saying it. And the committee notes that despite these reductions that it's providing across the portfolio, it's still a 13% increase over fiscal year 23 and a 63% increase over 22. So from the outset, the message is pretty clear. We've seen this kind of trajectory and a plateau coming, not just because of the political climate and the general fiscal climate that Todd outlined kind of, articulately at the outset there, but this is just, organic to the Space Force and DoD management of the space domain that I think is really independent of some of those macro issues. So the way we do things when we break up the $32 billion of the total DoD request for DoD space programs, we do it by portfolio. It's something that we have been doing this way since about fiscal year 17. It was a lot harder back then when it was all embedded inside the Air Force. Then it got its own budget that made it a little bit easier. But we still are. This is our own effort. This is like our Velos team making our best effort to put a one-to-one alignment of each individual program element to one of these portfolios. The portfolios are named as such because a lot of them align directly to the Space System Command PEOs and the way that they are characterized and name those PEOs, things like SDA, Space Domain Awareness, and Combat Power. You'll see that the third row from the bottom there. BMC3, these are space sensing. These are the PEOs inside of SSC. Some of the other ones, organizational investments, advanced R&D. These are things that we have used to kind of aggregate, onesie-twosie lines that maybe didn't have a direct correlation to one of these other portfolios. But it's something that we've been doing. We found it really useful. I have it sorted here by size of the request. So you can see kind of the relative proportion of each one of the elements, classified making up a huge portion thereof, Space Development Agency, O&M, Next Gen OPIR. I've also hidden the right, again, so that you're not distracted. This one is even a little bit more jarring than the last one due to the color coding. But bear with me, again, it's only a minus 3.5% on both of the appropriation side, effectively 3.5% cuts. We're still at 31.3 billion off of a $32 billion request. So really we're in the margins of the request. But if you look at just the appropriations landscape here by portfolio, you'll see that just, there is a very, consistent reduction across many of the portfolios. The authorizers who, I think Todd mentioned, and I think we all have a general sense of, they're a little bit less constrained by the amount of, direct allocation that they provide to programs. And you see that here. They come on very strong, as you'll see in some of the policy provisions, and that's really where they shine. But, the appropriators are providing some clear, overall guidance that these portfolios are, coming to a plateau based on the rationale, program, schedule, justification, and acquisition performance of the inherent, component programs. I also want to just highlight again the portfolio alignment here as we transition to the next slide, because the next language that you'll see here from the House Appropriations Committee, be still my heart, right? This speaks to me personally on a level that I think you will come to appreciate as I go through it here, but also speaks to a very kind of important substantive development for the portfolio, which is to say that the House Appropriations Committee included in its bill this year language that says that they are aware of proposals over the various years to consolidate and align budgets into capability portfolios. Sound familiar? And that it might be worthwhile to implement this approach or organizing around specific mission areas. That the Space Force might serve as a great starting point for doing something like that, and that mission portfolios such as missile warning, SATCOM, and PNT would be a potential starting point, as would enterprise management, IT, facilities, and logistics, for example. Gives kind of why you would do this, and that it would provide, a clear statement of the missions and goals of each program. To clarify, there's some MIP and NIP that may be serve as a potential model for this. It wouldn't substitute the actual submission, but it would be a supplement to that. There was a report due to the committee just, a couple weeks ago, a week and a half ago, September 1st. I don't know if that's been submitted. If anyone talks to the House Appropriations Committee, we should ask them, and I certainly would be. And we should anticipate that this arrangement might be something we start seeing in the fiscal year budget request right around my birthday time. So with that, I'm going to go into more of the individual portfolio assessments. I'm going to do a quick check on time. Doing all right. Again, these are the individual portfolios that you saw earlier, but with a little bit more of a focus on what are the key committee positions that they've taken either in funding or in policy provisions. And so when Todd and I got together and briefed this a few months back, many more months back now at this point, at the request stage, one of the big takeaways I had, and we all saw, was that in the next gen OPIR program, the largest component of the space sensing portfolio inside of the Space Force, outside of SDA, there was a proposal inside the budget to cut a third geosynchronous spacecraft from the architecture. So when I briefed that, I was definitely looking to see how the committees would dispose of that. To be candid, the funds were not added back in, but there is concern expressed kind of relatively consistently across committees over the cut. And there's language from both the HAC and the SASC that says they have not received kind of comprehensive analysis to that end. HAC goes so far as to fence funding for another space sensing program, the Resilient Missile Warning, Missile Tracking MEO layer. 10% of those funds cannot be spent until a report on this GEO3 cut is delivered. So again, it sustains the cut, but with reservations. Frankly, a little surprised that it even sustained the cut. And this portfolio did, when you look at the overall total reduction by SASC that reduces it by 3.5%, this portfolio is a large portion there of it. And the next gen OPIR program is, getting reduced by over 400 million across its 4 component lines, the biggest which is in the polar line. concurrency is a word I saw throughout the marks. Basically funds that were for a phase 2 being requested or allocated or contracted or awarded in a fiscal year before even the prior phase was completed. And I think that was the concern here in the polar phase. In that language I briefed earlier from HAC that was talking about, the poor management, frankly, of some of the components of the space portfolio. It indicated there were some programs by name that they believe or know to not be fully funded in the FYDP, and Next Gen OPIR's ground element called Forge was specifically called out by the House Appropriators. The other half, the other big component of the resilient missile warning of the space sensing portfolio is this new, now kind of in its second fiscal year inside the budget, resilient missile warning, missile tracking architecture. That architecture is split where the Space Systems Command SSC manages the MEO component. So there's 791 million, as you'll see here, that is contributing to this slide. But SDA also contributes to that same mission, the resilient missile warning, missile tracking. They can contribute to the LEO portion, and they are briefed on the next slide for that component of the resilient missile warning, missile tracking. Bottom line, though, is across the board, that's a $2.3 billion investment, MEO, LEO, ground, different orbitologies, and generally speaking, across all the committee marks, that 2.3 billion is very much supported. The biggest of all the cuts was from SAC relative to MEO space vehicle savings 1 through 6. There is some concern about ensuring that this remains to be an open competition throughout the architecture development of this resilient missile warning, missile tracking layer, as evidenced by the language from SASC. So that's really one of the biggest components, kind of sets the stage for how we'll look through each one of these modules. I won't go through every single one of them in detail, but I do want to cover all the highlights. These slides will be provided, after the presentation for you to go through. We're also available both, as NSSA and on the detailed analytics side, on the VLA side, to brief these, individually as well as your time permits. So Space Development Agency, it's a story I love to tell because I go back and I look every time, and I think the first fiscal year that they were funded was fiscal year 20, and they were funded at $120 million. In fiscal year 22, that grew to 1.4 billion, fiscal 23, 3 billion, and fiscal 24, this request, even if you take the most cautious approach, the allocations from the House and Senate appropriators, still 4.5 billion. It's gone from 125 million in just 5 fiscal years. So it's here, it's real, it's here to stay. It has a very important component of the proliferated warfighter space architecture. Both doing tracking and transport, and we've kind of gotten through tranche 0 and tranche 1 and are looking forward to tranche 2. No looking back in terms of political support and continued support on Capitol Hill. Largely speaking, this $4.6 billion request is fully funded effectively at $4.5 billion with some minor modifications. I will say that there is so just to go back to the last slide, as I mentioned, the resilient missile warning, missile tracking architecture has a LEO component that's managed by SDA, fully funded. That's 1.6 billion of the SDA's 4.6 total is just that resilient missile warning, missile tracking component. And again, continued support from really all authorizers and appropriators. SAS did have a provision that said they wanted and really directed middle tier acquisition authority, which is what's being used, I think, or has been approved for tranche 1 for remainder tranches of the SDA PWSA, Proliferated Warfighter Space Architecture. And that was directly opposed in the White House Statement of Administration Policy. For those that are familiar or need a reminder, the White House, after these pieces of legislation are advanced, put out very specific positions on things that give them a lot of concern. And requiring middle tier acquisition authority for SDA's future tranches was something that they were uncomfortable with. They directly opposed that provision and believe that there may be different acquisition approaches that may be more appropriate, and that it's already approved for transport and tracking layers 1. it's not all 100% roses. The House of Authorizers need a little bit more explanation about where this proliferated warfighter space architecture, as it relates to the missile warning, missile tracking components thereof, how do those fit and integrate into the larger missile warning architecture, which is admittedly much, much greater than the Space Force and much greater than the Space Development Agency and its role. And so they, I think, need a little bit more explanation and rationale on where that fits. I will say that there's also this language that continues to encourage Space Development Agency to fill 3 SCS, not 2 service billets. For a long time, I think they've been at 2, or at least that's their position, is to have gone from 3 and remain at 2. And SASC, has given them all authority and in law, and strongly encouraged them in policy to fill that billet. It remains to be seen if they will adjust accordingly. Another big one, a huge one, both in component of the budget, but also kind of taking up the political wind inside of the space portfolio, is assured access to space. It funds not only the National Security Space Launch Enterprise, so think ULA, SpaceX, what needs to get to orbit for the Space Force, DoD, and the intelligence agencies go on the NSSL, launch architecture, launch enterprise, but it also includes some of the more agile, smaller stuff as well. Generally speaking, good support for this across the committees. There is some minor cuts from the Senate appropriators to the procurement line, but when you're really talking about the size and scope, I still think they'll be able to get the 10 launches that they're seeking in the request. There is additional funding, kind of at the state and local level. There's really positive language. One thing, that we like to highlight, amidst some of the doom and gloom, both an ad from House and Senate appropriators that would increase investments for state-owned launch range service and capabilities. Not a ton of detail, but really an acknowledgement of the role that the important role that they play, and the larger role that they could play as these architectures evolve. If you've attended any of these briefings for the last 3 years, you've heard me talk about tactically responsive space. It was in the budget for the first time this year, as opposed to only coming through congressional ad. Despite being in the budget, it continued to get congressional support from both HASC and HAC, with an additional ad on top of the budget request. On the policy side, on assured access to space, on the NSSL side, first and foremost, the thing that is most clear from the appropriators is you must use kind of this NSSL phase 2 contract, effectively the ULA SpaceX contract, period, and stop. You cannot do delivery on orbit of a capability or a service if that's what you're thinking. You can't buy a commercial launch on your own if that's what you're thinking, unless you come to us with a rationale. That's kind of been a consistent refrain ever since the appropriators kind of divested our nation in the RD 180 and established the investments that kind of put us in a position to be able to make that mandate. So that's always first and foremost. The other really big issue inside of the NSSL launch enterprise is the phase 3, the kind of future acquisition strategy. So all of the kind of commercial providers and authorizing and appropriating committees and the Pentagon are kind of, in close contact in negotiation about how this should look. Generally speaking, what we're talking about is creating multiple lanes for emerging commercial providers in some class of launches to have access to NSSL-like or NSSL launches, and then have a different lane for the more traditional, certified, traditional, what is now phase 2 launch enterprise. How the different committees approach that varies from committee to committee, the largest differential being SAS creating not one lane, not 2 lanes, but a lane 2A that basically is like rapid access to the launch lane 2 ecosystem for those that can get there quicker. But generally speaking, general alignment that there's this one lane for emerging providers, open competition to help develop our domestic launch enterprise, and then a launch lane 2 for the more traditional required launches. The last thing on the assured access to space I wanted to highlight is that DoD had a alleged proposal that has been in many fiscal years, I believe, in the making, and has kind of finally made its way over in February this year, along with the budget request as a formal Department of Defense legislative proposal. They call it commercial space launch support services. But really what they're looking to do is to kind of change the way that they seek cost reimbursement for the commercial launch service that are provided at the government-owned launch facilities. So, that's something that I think they stepped out kind of aggressively, and to their credit, both the HASC and the SASC, it doesn't adopt kind of verbatim the language in the DoD ledge proposal, but it certainly adopts, 50% of it and the large thrust. And if anything, it gives more discretion and wherewithal on the implementation side rather than dictating it in law. And I think that's, from everything that I've heard from the commercial providers, it's a public policy argument that they understand, which is to say that the enhanced commercial participation in these government-owned launch ranges warrants kind of greater contribution on a pro rata share, or however, whatever methodology is determined in kind of an open way to determine that cost sharing basis for use of those government-owned facilities. So I think commercial's on board, Pentagon's on board, Hill seems to be on board. One of those areas where we can highlight a win. 142. We're going to go for maybe one more slide because it's a bloodbath on this next one. And then, Matt, I'll pass it back to you for maybe some questions from you and then the audience. On comms and PNT, as you can see here, pretty substantial cuts. I highlighted as well, and want to end here, not because I'm a doom and gloom, but because, there's $500 million reductions from multiple, both the authorizers and the appropriators, but for different reasons. So we'll start with the SAC side. The Senate appropriators, they reduced two substantial programs that are both kind of elements of the follow-on to AEHF. The Evolved Strategic SATCOM, ESS, is the strategic component, whereas PTS is the kind of proliferated tactical component. And both got substantial reductions, not insignificant, 42%, 35% reductions. On the Senate, on the Evolved Strategic SATCOM side, they talk about vendor termination. Again, we see the word concurrency on the PTS side. And so those, as Todd said earlier, the House and Senate, have different approaches to how they've applied their allocations. As Todd was pointing out across the colors of money, but even inside these two cuts that both amount to about minus 3.5% total, they're applying the cuts many ways similarly, but the amounts are very different. And this is one area where the House appropriators did not follow suit, and the House authorizers have a different bone to pick. And if you just scroll down to the first bullet here under policy provisions, that reduction is relative to a prior ad that Congress gave in the 11th hour, kind of without notice in any of the prior marks and prior fiscal appropriation for 23. They provided additional funding for another bird. And this provision inside the HASC bill would effectively rescind those funds and fence any funds for that purpose until the Department and Space Force certify that the requirements could not be met by commercial. So a pretty aggressive approach. That's one of those issues that I'll be looking to see. Is that going to be stuff that sticks in conference, or these big cuts to things like space sensing, Evolved Strategic SATCOM, PTS, or on the Senate side, are these going to be the ones that prevail? The last thing I'll just highlight, everyone often asks me about, the commercial aspect, and it is worth noting that there is a proposal by the Senate appropriators in their mark to rename one of the lines, which is commercial SATCOM integration, to commercial space services, to align with the commercial space, the commercial services office, the COMSO inside of SSC, and provides additional funding, again, outside of the SATCOM lane that it was originally titled broader aperture and actually provides funding for commercial space-based remote sensing. So with that, I've got there's every one of the other portfolios is briefed, and you can kind of do that at your convenience. But I'd rather answer questions about what you might have on your mind.
Thank you, Mike. And thanks, Todd, for those insightful presentations. Let's turn to some Q&A, as Mike said. I'll start the questioning, but once again, please feel free to submit your questions at the Q&A button below. For the first question, I'll direct it to Todd. How much support for commercial space was included in the committee marks?
Sure. Yeah, I would say overall, the sense I get from reading the various reports on these bills is that there continues to be a positive feeling towards commercial space capabilities and the role they'll play in the future space architecture. So I think that's good. I don't see as many specifics this year as I feel like I have seen in previous years. A few things that kind of jumped out to me. One is in the Senate version of the NDAA. They're encouraging the establishment of an outer net. They're recommending $15 million in funding. I hope that name does not stick, but it is basically the idea of a hybrid space architecture that extends internet-like capabilities into space for the military. So they're recommending a $15 million investment there. Of course, it's an authorization bill, so it doesn't actually provide the funding. But I thought that was interesting because that is specifically targeted at leveraging some of these commercial SATCOM companies that are building essentially portions of the internet in space. Yeah, the House NDAA bill, it was interesting in there because it is directing the Space Force to expand its threat sharing. That is the sharing of information about threats to space systems with commercial space companies that do business with DoD. And so I think that's something that, a lot of people in the community, would applaud and would encourage. And I don't see much resistance to that, except that, they're obviously going to run into classification issues depending on which commercial space companies are dealing with and how they're cleared and whether they have access to cleared facilities, et cetera, which is another reason for downgrading classification of things that should be open source anyway. In the HAC-D bill, the biggest thing in there, and it's not specific to space, but I think it will include space to some extent. The HAC-D bill includes $1 billion in what they're calling a hedge portfolio. That is funding that they want to route through DIU to invest in, advanced, innovative types of capabilities that are largely coming from the commercial sector. I could see commercial space companies definitely getting a piece of that work. The SAC-D bill adds $40 million for the commercial space office. And that is specifically for to allow them to do COCOM direct tasking for commercial space-based ISR. And that is something, it's noteworthy. Myself, many others have been pushing the Space Force to really get serious about leveraging commercial space-based ISR. And so this would give them money in FY24, dedicated money in their budget to go out and start doing that. Also included in that SAC-D bill is an additional $10 million specifically for commercial space-based ISR to support Southcom and Southcom specific needs as one of the lesser served of the geographic commands. So, those are just some of the highlights of things I saw. I don't know if Mike would have others that he would want to highlight as well.
No, definitely some of the ones that you highlighted. And I think, it's important to remember, like when the request comes out from the department, and you look for commercial elements, it's often more of a challenge than when you're looking through a congressional mark, right? Certainly on the authorizing side, it's not supremely difficult to get language recognizing the contribution of commercial capabilities to a certain mission or platform. But there are real investments in commercial capabilities throughout these hill marks, because that really is, where these commercial providers go when they feel like they're not getting what they, think is appropriate in the budget, and looking for opportunities to supplement that. So you mentioned, commercial remote sensing, from commercial space-based remote sensing in the Senate. There's also some provisions similar to that in the HASC, NDAA. There's commercial weather data acquisition, commercial space domain awareness data purchases, the role of commercial SATCOM, kind of being the forestall to that WGS 12, 400 million. So you see it throughout the hill marks often, Matt, right? That's where it's easy to find. It's where we will always look, at conference to see where they stick. And then the real test, and we saw a little bit that with things like tactically responsive space, where things transition from, purely hill advocacy on a commercial front to really being kind of adopted, or at least, considered earnestly by the department and integrated into its own request moving forward, rather than just being a hill ad. Over.
Thanks. Question here from the audience. Is space mobility and logistics getting more funding? Does this fall under assured access to space?
It's a great question. It's definitely getting more reference and more, I think, attention that I've seen in language. There was language, and I just mentioned it, in the tactically responsive space line, which is, as you said, in the assured access to space portfolio. There's language that talks about forward basing of on-orbit assets in a tactically responsive space context. That could be, manufacturing on orbit. It could be prefab. It could be any number of things. But to look at that through the lens of tactically responsive space, that's the first time I've seen that. As I've been looking through, the marks. I think it's an area that we will continue to see more and more of, as there's geopolitical influences, kind of driving innovation domestically in that area, and the need for that, as well as just the pure mission utility. Todd, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I'd echo that, and I would say, I think it would be really prudent for the Space Force to come out and name space logistics, which can include a lot of things, including increased mobility, things like that. But name space logistics as one of its key mission areas. Now, that would be a new mission area to open up for the Space Force. It's something that largely, wasn't an issue, wasn't a possibility in the past. But where we are today, I think space logistics is going to be a growing area, mission area for the Space Force. I'd like to see it come out and really acknowledge it and prioritize it that way.
Yeah, and that actually reminded me, there was language, I think I highlighted for maybe in the advanced R&D section, but the SASC is looking to modernize, quote unquote, the JSIDS the process, so the requirements generation process, with an acknowledgement of how kind of unresponsive commercial, I think, providers feel that can be, that whole kind of bureaucratic process can be, to being responsive to warfighter need and responsiveness to technological innovation. So something like that in the context, as an exemplar in space mobility and logistics, to say this is an area where we can't let requirements, per se, in the most traditional JSIDS way, necessarily impede our adoption of technological innovation. And I think that's really what the Senate is trying to do, at least the Senate authorizers section 802 is at least conceptualizing. Over.
Great. Question starting for you, Todd. Were there any surprises in these marks, cuts, adds, or policy provisions that were unexpected?
Yeah, overall, I don't know that anything just yet jumps out as a big surprise. That usually happens in the final version of the appropriations bill that gets included in an omnibus package. And then you see something like, oh, WGS 12, who was talking about that? How did that get in there? So I will hold my breath to see some of the big surprises like that. One thing, though, that I was encouraged, if not surprised, to see included was something Mike pointed out earlier, with the HAC-D putting in language requiring the Space Force to come back with them on a plan to show new budget exhibits and making the Space Force kind of the pathfinder for overall DoD in developing new budget exhibits that frame the budget differently, frame it by mission area rather than by the appropriations titles and PEs and line items, which is an interesting way of looking at the budget. I don't know if we're going to get away from that anytime soon, regardless, but it's not particularly informative if you want to look at the budget from a strategic perspective. And so, I mean, that's exactly why Mike has been doing this hard work himself and trying to reverse engineer a mission area view of the budget, is because that is more insightful if you want to look at real, strategic shifts and trends in the budget. And so I think it's really encouraging that the House appropriators are writing that into the bill to push DoD and the Space Force in particular in that direction.
Amen. Hear, hear. It's not just because I don't want to do that extra. We don't want to do that extra work. I actually enjoy it, as I think some of you have come to learn. But it's really because I think it does provide the value statements that the committee provides in its rationale for the whole Space Force budget exhibit proposal. It can provide insights that maybe are not apparent unless you start grouping things together. So very encouraged by that as well.
And one additional feature to it is beyond the actual detailed data, is just having an official categorization of mission areas from the Space Force. That just in itself provides a lot more insight into what their priorities are and how they're thinking about their job, right? We've got a new mission statement, from the Chief of Space Operations, but what's the next level of detail down from that? What are the Space Force's core mission areas? To have them put it in budget documents really codifies it for all of us to see and examine and scrutinize.
Amen. And it's nothing that's set in stone. It's something that's fluid, can evolve with time. Lines in and out. You can repackage things as we have been doing over the last 7 years, renaming portfolios to reflect alignment to PEO titles and such. So it's something that I cannot believe might come out around my birthday next year with the 25 requests. Honey, I hope you're listening.
What a birthday present.
We are running low on time, so I'll ask one final question and get both of your thoughts on it. What are the biggest issues to be resolved in conference? Biggest differences to reconcile?
I'll start with big picture, and that's obviously how do we keep the government funded? Let's at least get to a CR. But I think that they've got some differences in the overall defense bills, particularly on the Senate side. They put in an extra $8 billion in supplemental funding. And the way the budget caps are written, it's just like it was under the Budget Control Act, that emergency supplemental funding, OCO funding, that does not count towards your budget cap, right? And so if you label something as emergency supplemental, then that's extra, right? So that basically increases the overall top line for defense. So the Senate was putting $8 billion in there for emergency supplemental funding. The House is not doing that. They don't seem inclined to do that. And that's in it. And then in addition to this, we may have, Ukraine emergency supplemental funding as well. So I think, one of the big things they've got to work out is how much emergency supplemental, if any, are they going to allow into the defense bills? Now, once you do that, then depending on how much extra supplemental funding you add, beyond like direct Ukraine requirements, that then determines how many other trades you have to make down at other levels within the budget. So if you get, an extra 8 billion, 10, 15 billion in that emergency supplemental funding, then a lot of the tough trades between the Space Force and the other services, or even within the Space Force budget between different mission portfolios, let's go ahead and talk about it that way. Then those trades get a lot easier. If you don't get any emergency supplemental funding, if you're stuck at that budget cap as your top line, well, then the trades get harder. And if some in the House, get their way and they actually end up with a top line DoD budget that's less than the budget caps, then it's even more difficult. And the choices are going to get even more stark. But Mike, I don't know if you got some thoughts specifically about the space.
First, I'll just, Todd's much, better at this, at the DoD macro. I think he's got his finger on the pulse of, what's going to happen relative to the shutdown and the CR, certainly much better than I do. And also maybe I'm an irrational optimist, an irrational pragmatist, but to a certain extent, and I think you would acknowledge, we've been here before. This is not the first time we've seen brinksmanship from, a faction on this specific, these specific issues. Usually cooler heads prevail at the leadership level. I know that that's, even more constrained now than ever has been. But also, we have, to our credit, the progress that's been made by the committees. So maybe that can get us out of the woods. To answer Matt's question more directly, there are some just really substantial, huge cut differences between the House and Senate appropriators. Really big policy differences that are kind of highlighted throughout the presentation that really need reconciling. The top line cut between HAC and SEC relatively the same, but how they've allocated that 3.5% reduction is substantially different. And it reflects kind of consideration of the poor management they feel so far of the Space Force portfolio. So we'll see how much of that sticks in conference. But really appreciate your time, Todd. Matt, back to you.
Yeah, thank you to you both. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Thanks once again, Mike and Todd, for your insightful analysis. Thanks to the audience. Thanks for your probing questions. As Mike mentioned, the charts from this session will be available on the NSSA website. Give us a couple hours to get them uploaded. That's nssaspace.org. While you're there, take a poke around. A lot of other exciting activities in the association going on. With that, thanks again for joining us for today's highly informative space-time interview, and have a great day.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Todd.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, everybody.